Well, this is a video on how to play chess and consolidates many other videos here. So you're going to see me go to the video text page where it shows the URL for each individual video that you may use it later on. I would recommend write this down, www, I'll write it here for you, .youtube.com, and we're going to have to make this small enough that it all fits in here. This is the URL where you can find all of these individual videos, so you may want to write this, www.youtube.com/user/cgoldthorpe with the E on the end, and that after user that should be a slash, not a period. Goldthorpe/videos. Okay, make sure you get the S in there. Okay, and with this collection of videos, it should be all you need to learn how to play chess, not very much about how to play chess better. There's nothing about strategy in this part. This is simply the rules of chess. So we're going to start off with the chess board. So when we look at the chess board, it starts with a square, just a simple square. Then we're going to cut it in half horizontally and vertically. So that's going to look like this. All of this, if we're looking at this from white's side of the board, then on the left is the queen side with the A, B, C, and D files. You'll learn about that in a minute. On the king side, which is to the right of the center of the board, if you're looking at this from the perspective of the white pieces, then your king side will be the files E, F, G, and H. Now, if you're looking at it from black's point of view, the A will start over here on the right and it'll go over this way. A, B, C, D would then be the queen side over here on your right. But when you're the white pieces, your king side, E, F, G, H is to your right. So we have four quadrants of the board. We have the opponent's side of the board here, or black side of the board if you're white, and the white side of the board. And we have the queen side and the king side. Now, we further divide each of those horizontally and vertically into, and we have a quadrant in each quadrant, which will end up being four single squares, which would then look like this. This is the chessboard. It might seem a little bit difficult to navigate on. You should look up a game called Go, G-O, an Asian game. I'm not going to talk about that very much here, except to say that their board does not have alternately colored squares and is much larger than this, and young children learn it perfectly. So we should be able to learn this board. On this board, we're concerned about the squares, not the intersections of these lines. These are individual squares on which to put a piece. So pieces go not on intersections of lines, but within the lines in squares. So we have 64 discrete locations in this 8x8 two-dimensional array here, where we have the vertical columns, which are called files, F-I-L-E-S, and the horizontal rows, which we call ranks, RANKS. Okay, so we have 8 by 8. We have a 64 square chessboard. Now, one of the very first things that beginners need to do, and you have to know in advance that this is going to be hard to be motivated to do until you know how to play chess, but it is important and will help you to learn faster. Learn this chessboard. So since this is the A file, this square here is A1, this would be A2, this would be A3, this would be B1, B2, B3, this is C3, this is D4. That's F7, that's H8. You should be able to point to any square and immediately know what letter and number they are here. Also learn that A is 1, B is 2, C is 3, all the way up to H is 8. Know that if the board were turned around, A is like H. In the beginning of the game, the rooks are on the A and the H file. The knights are on the B and G file. The bishops are on the C and F file. The queen file is the D file, and the king file is the E file. The 5th rank for white is the very first one, which is in black's half of the board. The 4th rank is the one in white's half of the board. And the dividing line vertically is between the between the D and E file. Okay, if we color this alternately, it's a little bit easier to see, like this. Note that the lower right corner will be a white square, or we could say a light square. So it would look like this. Okay, so let's take a look at a slightly nicer looking board. Here we are with the letters for the files and the numbers for the ranks written here. So this square here would be F6. So this is the image that you may want to pause the video and do a screenshot of this image, then print it onto a piece of paper, and then drill yourself to the point where you can point to any square and you immediately know what the letter and number are, or that someone can say a letter and a number and you can immediately find such a square. So if I say C7, you should be able to go here immediately without any confusion. If you're still having to go A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, if you're still trying to do that, you don't know the chessboard yet. So if you can, learn the chessboard before you even learn the pieces. So now we're going to get familiar with the pieces. So let's see what they look like. We'll come back over to here. This is the rook. This one. You can see how he moves when I click on him, horizontally and vertically. You can jump across any number of empty lines. You're going to see a video that explains the movement of each and every individual piece. That's why I'm not spending a lot of time on it here. The bishop moves diagonally only. The bishop cannot move like a rook. The rook can never move diagonally like a bishop. The queen can move like a rook or like a bishop. Okay? Same for the king, except the king can only move one square at a time. The knight goes to the nearest opposite colored square which is not right beside him. I'm going to say that again. The nearest opposite colored square that is not beside him. I used to learn this by up 2 and over 1. I'm not going to go into a long discussion here on why I don't like to teach it that way, but indulge me, trust me, don't do it that way. If the knight's in a dark square, he's going to go to a white square. It will always be just barely outside of these squares next to the knight. The knight can never go to the same color square he's already on, and he can never go to a square right beside him, and the knight can never move like any other piece. Okay, so now we're ready to dive in and start looking at the various pieces and how they move. So I'm going to go to the pawn and the knight first. Now this is unusual because the rook and the bishop are pretty easy, and then you can simply say that the queen can move like a rook or a bishop. The king also moves like a queen, like a rook or a bishop, except only one square. And then the knight makes that weird curved move where he makes sort of two steps in a curve and ends up on the opposite color square from what he's on. So let's look at the pawn move first. This is the URL that you could use anytime you want to teach the pawn move. So that's a YouTube maneuver. Now let's take a little look at some people playing chess here.
This is the pawn. The pawn's move is very simple. It only moves one square directly straight ahead towards the opponent. That's the only direction it can move in, and that's the only way it can move. It moves only one, straight to the square in front of it.
So black's pawns go down.
Now,
white's
some of you are probably familiar and are going crazy right now because we didn't say that if a pawn has not moved before, in other words, if this is the first move for this pawn,
the pawn's on its second
which we
rank.
will know because it will still be on this rank where all the pawns begin, then the pawn can move up 2, or instead it could move up 1.
It's the only time
whichever one you decide.
It's the only time it has
but
the
the
option.
only time a pawn has the option of moving ahead 2 is when it has not yet moved. By the way, if two pawns are on the same file with no square between them, right up against each other, neither pawn can capture. Not allowed. The pawn can never move like this either.
Just remember P, C, D. Pawns capture diagonally. They capture diagonally. If they capture, they must move diagonally. They cannot move diagonally unless they capture. They cannot capture going straight ahead. If they don't capture, they must move straight ahead. If they capture, they go diagonally. It's the only piece where the capturing and non-capturing move are different, and this is why the pawn is potentially confusing.
That's not allowed. However, that is the way that a pawn captures. So this pawn has the option of moving forward or capturing. If it were white's turn, this pawn can only capture. It can't go forward. This pawn cannot move here, but it could move forward, or it could capture. Now, there is a rule called en passant, which has to do with a pawn passing another pawn's capturing square. This is how it works. Your pawn would be just barely in your opponent's half of the board. Your opponent has a pawn in the adjacent file. That means the file right beside the file that your pawn is in. Here the white pawn is in the D file. The black pawn is in the file right beside it, E. This white pawn could capture to this square. He could also capture to that one. If this pawn moves up 2, he's jumped over white's capturing square. He moved up 2, and he's beside you. Oh, create a situation here where we can do this. Okay, now let's say white went here and black goes here. Now white can make this move.
Only if
Okay,
it's his next
see
move.
that again.
Only if it is his next move.
Black moves his pawn up. White captures it en passant, just as he would have been able to do if the pawn had moved up only one.
En passant is E-N-P-A-S-S-A-N-T. En passant. It's French for in passing.
However, there is a difference. If black moves his pawn only one, then if white does not capture it on the next move, he may still have the option of capturing this pawn as long as it's his move and these two pawns are in this position. However, if the pawn makes its double move, jumping over my capturing square, this is my only opportunity on my next move
for this particular
to capture it en passant. If I don't do so, I have lost the option of making that en passant capture. Now, what happens when your pawn gets to the other side of the board? What happens is you promote it. This is an obligation. That means you have to do it. It's not an option. An option is where you do it if you want to. Here, white would normally promote to a queen because the queen is the most powerful piece in most positions. However, it doesn't have to be. I could turn it into a rook, or I could turn it into a knight. If I undo this move. Or I could make it a bishop. I can make it anything except another pawn or a king. So it can be a queen, a rook, a knight, or a bishop. I have never seen any practical opportunity where it actually made sense to turn it into a bishop. However, I have seen numerous situations where it made sense to make it a rook or to make it a knight. So, the pawn moves one at a time. It can move two on its first move. It always goes straight forward
when it
does not capture. It must move diagonally to capture and cannot move diagonally when it does not capture. If you make your double move and jump over your opponent's capturing square for one move only, they have the option of capturing it. When you get a pawn to the other side of the board, you must promote the pawn on that square, meaning you will replace the pawn with a knight, bishop, rook, or queen, and take the pawn off the board. Doesn't matter where it goes, and your piece that you promoted it to must go on the square the pawn reached. It takes on the powers of that piece immediately, but that does end that player's move.
Okay. So this was the pawn. Now, if you're a teacher and you just showed that, you think maybe, okay, the kids now know how the pawn moves. No, they don't. No, they don't. Maybe a few of them do because they already played chess. It's very important to go back and quiz them. If you're learning chess on your own this way, or you're teaching your kids from this video, you have to reiterate all about en passant, about pawn promotion, how the pawn captures, and how he moves, and the special move, moving up two on its first turn. So there's quite a few details. So the pawn is maybe the most difficult. I would say the knight is the next most difficult one. So next we're going to look at the knight. Now at the end of this, if you're really clear on how the knight moves and how the pawn moves, then you should be able to move on to the other pieces pretty quickly and easily. So let's take a look at how the knight moves here. And it's very important that anybody learning this has to be absolutely sure that they're perfectly crystal clear on how the pieces move before you move on. So, without further ado, let's go to the knight's move.
The knight is a rather difficult piece. That's why this part is a little bit longer than the other pieces. I'm going to remind you that the knight cannot ever move to any square right beside him. The knight cannot ever move to a square on the same diagonal, or for that matter, any square the same color as the square he's moving from.
No, these red arrows could be misleading to someone who hasn't seen this before. It may seem to you, especially if you have your volume turned off, that the knight actually moves this way. No, he doesn't. That's how a queen moves. This knight from here can only move to those squares that have the blue circle on them.
He cannot move to any square on the same vertical column, the same file. He cannot move to a square on the same rank. This knight will switch the color of square he moves to every time he moves. If he starts on a black square, he goes to a white square. If he starts on a white square, he goes to a black square. It's the nearest opposite colored square which is not right next to him. So this knight cannot move here, 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 or here. Since the knight cannot move like a rook, it cannot move here, or here, or here, or here. So how does the knight move? Whatever color square the knight is on, the squares he can move to are not right next to him, not on the same file or rank. They're the nearest square which is not in line with him. If a queen were on the square the knight is on, the queen would not be able to go where the knight can go. The knight, again, he switches color every time he moves. He will never move to a square right next to him, but the square he moves to is just one step farther away. So let's look at his pattern again of where he can move to. We'll put a knight here. Okay, now where are the squares he can go to? Notice if the letter is of the square that the knight can go to, if it's different by only one letter from where the knight is now, then the number will be different by 2. If the number is different by 2, then the letter will only be different by 1. Every single square that this knight can move to is a black square because he's on a white square. Notice that this knight cannot move to any square right next to him. Notice that any one of these moves is a move that no rook or bishop or any other piece of whites or blacks could do except a knight. Only a knight can move like a knight. Every square is just 2 steps away. See, it's just like 2 steps away. You could think of it like a curved move, but it's better to just think of it as a single move, directly to the square. This is how the knight moves. It's right in between the move of a rook and a bishop. Right in between. It looks like a spider. See? These are the squares that the knight can go to. Every square that the knight can move to is the same distance from the knight as any other square the knight can move to. So these are the squares the knight can go to from here. Notice now, with the knight on a black square, he can move only to white squares. You need some practice with the knight to make sure you understand it, because it is important to move the knight often.
Okay, you may want to, if you're showing this to kids under 8 years old who haven't played chess before, especially if they never played other games before, they're going to need to see that a few times. They're going to need to see the video on the pawn a few times and make sure they've got both of those down pat before you go on. So, now we're ready for the rook move, which is a very short video, about 40 seconds. So let's see what that looks like.
The rook moves horizontally to the right or left, or vertically, forward or backward. The rook may jump over any number of empty squares, but cannot jump over a square occupied by a piece, one of his own or of his opponent's. If the opponent had a piece there, now the white rook cannot go to this square and can only go this far, including the square the knight is on. If the rook goes to that square, he replaces the knight. Now he is on the square and the knight is out of the game for the rest of the game. This is how we make a capture.
Okay, so as you can see, the rook is pretty straightforward. Sometimes you get a question, how far can the rook go? And the answer is he can jump over any number of empty squares. So he can go all the way across the board in one move as long as nothing is in the way. So after the knight and pawn, we do the rook and the bishop, so that when we talk about the queen, we can simply say the queen moves like a rook or a bishop. So here is the bishop. I also like to remind people, I say BXR plus. The B for bishop moves like an X. The R for rook moves like a plus. BXR plus. So we just saw how the rook moved. Horizontally.
This is a bishop. The bishop moves diagonally only,
Forwards
so
or
it would
backwards?
stay on the same color squares.
Forever.
Like the rook, the bishop can jump over any number of empty squares, but cannot jump over a square that has a white or a black piece or pawn on it. So we say BXR plus. The B for bishop moves like an X. R for rook moves like a plus.
And so now that we've done the rook and bishop, after we did the pawn and knight, and it's important to understand the reason why you do the pawn and knight, the difficult ones first, is because then the rest are going to seem easy, and you're also going to weed out the people who just are not able to learn, because there are people who can learn all of the pieces except the knight and the pawn, and then they might not feel very good about themselves that they're not getting it, might be a little bit frustrated. So teach them the knight and the pawn first, then the rook and the bishop, and then finally you can go to the queen move and then the king move. So now let's take a look at the queen move.
The queen can move like a rook, horizontally or vertically, or it could move like a bishop, diagonally. Like the rook and bishop, the queen can only jump over a square which is empty.
So from there, of course, we go to the king. And essentially, you can move your queen to a dumb square where your opponent just gets to capture it for free, but you're not allowed to do that with the king. The one thing that's always confusing beginners is this idea that you're supposed to get the king, but you're not allowed to get the king. So I'm going to leave you to find good ways to explain that. I have to assume that if you're teaching, you know how the pieces move. But that's important to make that very clear, that if someone leaves their king in check, or for that matter makes any illegal move, it should be just as if the move never even happened. Then the illegal move must be retracted, undone. And then it's just like it never even happened. It is still that person's turn, and they must still make a legal move. Now, if you're playing in a tournament, you may want to talk about touch move. But when people are just learning, we don't need to go into that right away. Okay, so
this is the king. You see all these squares right beside the king, touching the king either by a whole side or by the corner. These are all of the squares right next to the king. You could say that the king can move like a rook or a bishop, just like the queen, but the king is limited to one square, and he can never move next to the other king. A king can never be allowed to be on a square that an enemy piece could move to.
Energy is all there is. You know, there is
this
nothing
idiot.
else. I want every...
Okay, so we've gone through 6 different kinds of pieces. Now, with the king, before you talk about castling, they really have to understand check so that they can know what you're talking about when you say you can't castle while you're in check or through check. So after all the pieces, check, checkmate, and stalemate must precede, that is, come before the discussion about castling, even though castling is part of the basic rules. So we're going to see about check, checkmate, and stalemate.
Okay, this video is from chesschesschess.com. I'm Chris Goldthorpe, and I'm going to be talking to you about check.
Well, now it's chrischess.com instead. So, moving on.
Checkmate, stalemate, and check. This is a checkmate that we have on the board right now. So, we have to know what check is and what checkmate is. Normally, if you have a piece and you attack your opponent's piece, the rook moved to here, and the rook is now said to be attacking the bishop. Now, the bishop might be guarded, so although the bishop is attacked, it is not truly threatened. We normally consider a rook to be worth more than a bishop. But if I capture the bishop and black takes my rook, or even if he doesn't take the rook, the game goes on. A bishop can be captured. A rook can be captured. Only the king can never be captured. So, when I attack a piece which is not the king, you might capture this rook if you had a piece in a position to do so. You might put a piece on one of the squares between the rook and the bishop, or you might move the bishop. But you could also just sacrifice the bishop, even if you could not capture back. That is not an option with the king. When the king is in check, he must get out of check. I'm going to change this position a little bit. And we're going to look at 3 ways to get out of check. You might not have all 3 ways. You might not even have 2 ways. If you don't even have one of these ways of getting out of check, you're in checkmate and the game is over. Here the rook goes to this square. Now it's black's move, of course. If it were white's move and the black king were not on that square, white would have the option of moving his rook to the square that the black king is on right now. So we can certainly say that right now the rook is attacking the king, and an attack on the king is always a threat. Black could capture the rook to get out of check. Black could interpose a piece. We call that blocking. Take, block, or run. So take is to capture, and block means to interpose, to put a piece on a square between the attacker and the king. And there's always the option of simply moving the king. Run. Take, block, or run. If not, you're done and they won. Let's look at the difference between a check you can get out of and a check you cannot get out of. Let's suppose that white has a knight here and black has a king on the back rank, and white's rook, because it goes all the way across, prevents this king from moving to any of those squares I just marked. White moves his knight here to put black in check. Is black in checkmate? Well, we know that he cannot go here or here or here because of the rook. But he can go here and he can go here. If he has even one way to get out of check, he is not in checkmate. By the way, because a knight can jump, you can never block a knight. You could only capture him or move your king, if you can do either. So let's see what a checkmate looks like. We're going to use a couple of rooks, and the black king is over here, and it's white's move. White now moved his rook all the way down to the back rank. It was important to use that rook and not this one, because this one is the one that's keeping black's king from moving out away from the back rank. And this rook sees all of these squares. So the king is in check and he cannot move out of check. So that would be a checkmate. White won the game. Another way that this could be a checkmate would be if the white king were here. A king can never move next to another king because he would be putting himself into check. So here black cannot get out of check. If you're in check and you can't get out of check, that is a checkmate. Of course, in a real game, you could never have 2 white kings on the board at the same time, so just ignore this one back here for the time being. But this position is a little different. This is a very rare type of stalemate that you will probably not see in any practical game. Here it is black's move. Black cannot move his king here or here because the rook would be able to capture it, and you are not allowed to put your king on a square that an enemy piece can move to. Likewise, black cannot capture the rook because white's king is guarding it. However, because the rook cannot move like a bishop, and this king certainly can't move too, he also can't jump over the rook, so neither the rook nor the white king is putting black in check. Black is not in check, but he has no legal move that he can make. So the game stops. It ends right here as a stalemate, which is one type of draw, a tie. Both players get 1/2 of the point. They both halfway win and halfway lose. Here's another stalemate situation. Let's suppose this pawn is down here and black's king is here and white is here. Now when white moves here, the game is a stalemate because pawns cannot capture going straight ahead. This pawn could capture to here or to here, so black cannot move to those squares, and this king can go one square in any direction, so the king is guarding this pawn and he's guarding that square, but there is nothing attacking the square d8 which black's king is on right now, and black has nothing else to move besides his king, so black cannot move any piece. He has no legal move, but he's not in check. No check, no move equals a stalemate. A stalemate is a draw. Here's another type of a stalemate. Let's put the queen here and the black king here and white's king here. Let's suppose white moves his king closer because he wants to do a checkmate by moving his queen to b7 like that to that square. However, it is now black's move, and he cannot move here, he cannot move here, he cannot move here, but the queen cannot move like a knight, nor can the king move 2 squares. So black is not in check right now. That's what matters. He's not in check. And he has no legal move. You can't be in a check that you can't get out of if you're not in check at all. This game is a stalemate if it is black to move here. So this is the difference between check and checkmate and stalemate. Check is a direct attack on the king. Checkmate is when you cannot get out of check. Stalemate is when there is no check, but you have no legal move.
Holy shit, these things are rad. Nice and roomy, but they don't fall off.
Oh my god.
Back at table 4, Galfond up by 15,000.
Okay, so that's check, checkmate, and stalemate. So you do the pawn and the knight first, then the rook, the bishop, the queen, and the king in that order. Then we talk about check, checkmate, and stalemate. Now we can go to castling. You might want to be making notes on this, and you may want to do a screen capture of this page. So this is the next one.
This segment is about castling. Castling is the only time during a game when you can move 2 pieces in the same turn. It's also the only time your king can move more than 1 square. The king will move 2 squares toward a rook, like toward this one. And then the rook will go to the square that the king hopped over. So let's look at that again. Notice that the king and rook do not switch places. Neither the king nor the rook will be on the 2 squares we see them on here. Neither one. Instead, They'll be on these two squares, between them. That's castling on the king side of the board. You could castle queen side as well. The king moves 2 squares towards the rook as before. Move the king first. The rook will go to the square right between the 2 squares that the king was on. The square he left, the square he goes to. The rook will be right beside the king. The rook will be on its own color, white rook on a white square. Before castling, the king will not be on his own color. After castling, the king also will not be on his own color, because when the king castles, he does not change the color of the square he's on. Notice that queenside castling looks a little different. We have 2 squares over here, but when we castle kingside, we have only 1. So it does look a little bit different. Now, same for black. His king will not be on its own color before and after castling, whether he castles kingside or queenside. There he goes, queenside. Okay, often when castling queenside, your rook has an open file. Now, when can you castle? You cannot castle while you are in check. So if black just somehow, I'm going to change the position to do this, but let's suppose black played this move and put white in check. White cannot check right now on this move. If he moves his king, he will never be able to castle during this game because he has moved his king, not because he was in check. So, if he got out of check any other way, in this case he blocked it, now he may still be able to castle later. You cannot castle through check. This rook now guards this square, among others. So my king cannot cross that to castle. This would be illegal. Also, if this bishop were, say, guarding this square, now white, if it were his move, cannot castle this way. Not allowed. Without the bishop there, I could castle. And of course, you cannot castle into check. So, if castling would put you in check, you certainly cannot do that. So here, white could castle on the queen side if it were his move. Let's see, is it his move? He's not in check. Oh, okay, this is because of changing the position. Alright, well this king cannot go here because he would be in check from the knight, but he could castle on the queen side. You can only castle once during a game. Castling is considered a move of the king. Castling must be the first move of the king and of the rook it castles with. So if I move the king, even if I put the king back on the square it started, I can't castle for the rest of the game. If I move my rook, then I cannot castle with that rook. So this is a good reason to leave the rooks alone until you get all of your knights and bishops off the back row. Probably your queen as well. This is castling then.
Okay. So the next thing we'll need to know, after how all the pieces move and how to castle, we've seen checkmate, we know how to win, and so the next thing we need to know about is the ways of getting a draw, and there are many. And all of these can come up in a game between beginners, even if there's no chess clock. The mutual time forfeit is the only one that required a clock, but with today's modern chess clocks, it's not possible to have a mutual time forfeit. So we have threefold repetition, we have draw by agreement, we have a draw by the 50 move rule. There are several ways to get a draw that we should know about. Stalemate was one of the ways that we already saw. So let's look at draw by the threefold repetition. And see how that works.
So it would make no sense for them to just sit here and go back and forth like this forever, making it an endurance contest. Luckily, chess does have a way of dealing with this. The third time, the position is exactly the same. In other words, all the same white pieces are on the same squares as before. All of the same black pieces are on the same square as before. It is the same player's turn to move each time. It is black to move here. And the position is the same for the third time, with the same player on move and the same set of legal moves available. En passant and castling could have something to do with that. So, in this case, there were no en passant issues, there were no castling issues. Both players, well, black is able to castle every time he's in this position. And so here, this could be declared a draw by either side. Tournament rules are a little more complicated for determining that, and I'm not going to go into that here because this is for beginners. But you need to know what threefold repetition is. Now, I'm going to show you another example of threefold repetition. Suppose white is back here, and he's got a couple of pawns, and we'll have black here in a situation where he feels that he's about to be checkmated, because he is about to be checkmated, it would seem, but he has a defense, and his defense involves threefold repetition. Threefold repetition does not have to involve itself with a check. It's not always a perpetual check, but often it is. Let's give black another pawn here. Okay, yeah, that pawn came from the e-file, captured twice. Okay, so here we are, and it is this is going to be black to move, and black is going to have a queen sitting here. And let's say that black also has a bishop here. Okay, in this position, black knows that he's about to be checkmated with this move here. Actually, let's change this position so that we can make it black to move. Okay, so let's say white goes here, which would be a silly first move because he could have made a checkmate, but I'm just setting up this position. So here we have this position. We can think that white just captured a black knight here. So now he is threatening to make a checkmate. Black gives white check here. White makes his only legal move. Black comes back, repeating. White goes here. Black repeats that position for the second time. White goes here. And black checks him again. So now white decides to go here. Okay, he checks him. He checks him again. Now this is the second time. White could here in a tournament call the tournament director when he intends to make a move which will create a threefold repetition. So here he would call the tournament director, telling him of his intention, circle on the score sheet the other two moves after which this position occurred, inform the director that he intends to execute a threefold repetition, should make this move, make his claim, and then hit the clock. This is a threefold repetition because black made the position repeat for 3 times. Each time it was the same player's turn to move and the same set of legal moves. The threefold repetition is just one way to make a draw. And let's remember that the word stalemate and the word draw are not interchangeable. The word draw is more generic. There are many ways to draw, and this is one of the ways to draw, the threefold repetition. Thank you. This is again Chris Goldthorpe from ChessChessChess.com.
And again, it is no longer ChessChessChess.com, it is ChrisChess.com. And so another way of getting draws is by the 50 move rule. We often see this in games between beginners where one person has a basic checkmate, such as a king and a rook against a king, but does not know how to execute. And so after chasing the defending king in vain without making progress, after 50 moves, the game is declared drawn. Basically, if you don't know how to win, you don't win.
Hello, this is Chris Goldthorpe from www.chesschesschess.com again.
And again, I'm correcting that, www.chrischess.com.
In this segment, I want to describe a rule called the 50 move rule. This move, fortunately for most chess players, does not occur the way I show it in this video. I show it in this video because the players who need to learn about such a basic rule might cause a 50 move repetition in the way that is shown here. But this will just be the first of a few examples on 50 move rule. Now, the 50 move rule states that when your opponent has made 50 consecutive moves without either player having made any capture or pawn move, you may claim a draw. So, at the point in time which he is about to make his 50th move, you should make your move, stop the clock, and then get the tournament director and say, my opponent is about to make his 50th move without any pawn moves or captures, and you may need to prove it with your score sheet. Good players know how to write their moves down and are expected to do so in tournaments. You'll find it's pretty easy when you learn how to do it, but this is one of the reasons why. Now in a casual game, you might just have some friend count your moves, or just decide, hey buddy, you don't know how to do a checkmate with a king and a rook, so we'll just call it a draw. Anyway, straight ahead with the example, let's suppose play follows like this. And there has been capturing, and there has been no pawn moves. What do you mean? Zzz. Now he avoids a threefold repetition once again. If you are a chess teacher, that you have seen exactly this many times. Obviously, white does not know how to do this checkmate, and if you're a tournament director who is also a chess teacher, you're very tempted to just declare it a draw automatically. But you do have to wait until the person who is the white pieces has made 50 moves. Unless black offers a draw and white takes it. Or unless white makes a really egregious mistake like this. So we need not go through all 50 moves. You get the idea here. Notice at one point we accidentally did a threefold repetition. However, if neither player notices the threefold repetition on their own, they might not make a claim. And just because it occurred during the game doesn't mean that the game is still open to having someone go back and say, hey, there was a threefold repetition there. No, that's not the way it works. But if the 50 move rule, if someone claims a draw by 50 move rule, it also works as a draw offer. So you may want to take a look at the segment on draws by agreement if you haven't already and are not familiar with such rules. So this was about the 50.
That's what we'll do next. And again, this is Chris with chrischess.com. That's ChrisChess.com. All right, so here is the draw by agreement, which is the most common type of draw with very strong players.
Hello, this is Chris Goldthorpe from www.chesschesschess.com again.
No.
This is in the continuing sequence.
It's chrischess.com.
Of instruction on the basic rules of chess. This is about the draw. This is specifically about a draw by agreement. So, looking at this position, whichever color you are, and you could be the opposite color here, like this, looking at it from white's perspective. But both players know that both players can see that there is no way for either side to make any move except king moves from now on. Neither king will ever get into the other person's half of the board. Obviously, this is a highly simplified situation, but it needs to be so that we can understand the concept. Sometimes there are games that grandmasters declare drawn that seem very interesting and imbalanced to amateurs, but to them it is as simple as this position you see. Here, obviously, either player may wish to save time, and no matter how bad of a player he thinks his opponent is, he knows that he cannot win, and so this game must end as a draw. So white, whose turn it is to play, makes a move, then offers a draw, and then stops his clock and starts his opponent's clock. Now his opponent, as long as they don't touch a piece, they can still take the draw. But once they touch a piece, white has the option of withdrawing the draw offer, but he is certainly not obligated to do so. So this position certainly will be readily agreed as drawn by either player. So white offers the draw. If black simply stops the clock and shakes hands at that point, no further words are needed, or if he says, I accept, or whatever. But if he makes a move and hits the clock, we can take that as a withdrawn or a declined draw offer. Now, once he declines the offer, he can request that you not offer any more draws after he's declined it 3 times in a row. He might say no draws, but you might still offer a draw, and with little chance of a real penalty. Obviously, in this highly simplified position, we're not going to see any such dispute. But the important thing is to know what a draw by agreement is. One player moves, offers a draw, and hits the clock if you're playing with the clock. The other player, having heard your draw offer, can accept your draw offer, or they can decline your draw offer, especially if they believe they can win. So this is how draws happen by agreement. If my opponent accepts my draw offer, we stop playing and we record the result of the game, which is 1/2 for each player.
Okay, so this is a good time to go back and maybe play this entire video again, and then maybe the next time you meet with your group as well. But it is absolutely essential that the students are absolutely crystal clear, perfectly clear all the time on how the knight move and how the pawn move. If they're still confused about those, nothing is more important than getting that straight first, and then they can learn the other rules. And from there, the important thing is to learn the rules. Make sure of what a stalemate is. Make sure of what a checkmate is. Learn these different types of draw and what causes them to come about. And then you can start talking about strategy and how to play better. Okay, so this should be enough to give anybody a good start on how to play chess. So again, this is from Chris Goldthorpe at chrischess.com, and that's going to conclude this video.